On an otherwise ordinary night in 2001, at around 3 in the morning, a deep-sea monitoring station off the north shore of Kauai suddenly picked up a series of abnormal signals. These signals weren't the high-frequency calls of orcas, nor the low rumble of an undersea volcano. Instead, they were rhythmic, almost eerily precise tapping sounds, like someone striking rocks over and over with a stone hammer, carefully selecting the right pieces for construction. The on-duty operator, Lena Costa, assumed it was just a technical glitch and didn't think much of it. But the next day, while reviewing years of archived monitoring data, Lena was jolted by a startling discovery. The exact same tapping occurred every year, right around the 15th day of the third lunar month, and the location of the sound? It was always fixed in the same spot, an area Hawaiian natives have long called the Menehune Abyss. What made things even stranger was that on the seafloor in that very region stood an ancient stone wall no one could explain. The construction was so advanced that even the joints between the stones were fitted so precisely that not even a blade could slip through. According to millennia-old local legends, the wall had been built overnight by a group of dwarves less than 1 meter tall. It was originally meant to serve as an underwater barrier to resist ocean currents, but somehow ended up submerged beneath the sea. And those tapping sounds that return every year, they seem to suggest that these dwarves are still working, still trying to finish a task left incomplete long ago. This mysterious group with engineering abilities far beyond what humans of that era could achieve is known as the Menehune. In the oral histories of native Hawaiians, the Menehune only move under the cover of night and never allow themselves to be seen by humans. If discovered, they immediately flee, migrate, and vanish without a trace. The Menehune never attack people, never steal food, and yet they are said to have constructed massive stone fish ponds, ancient water channels, and stone walls stretching hundreds of meters, all in isolated places where no one was around to witness it. Some say they are survivors of a prehistoric civilization. Others claim they are remnants of an extraterrestrial race. Still others believe they aren't earthly beings at all, but spirits who travel freely between land and sea. Menehune sites have been found on every major island in the Hawaiian archipelago, scattered across deep mountain forests, coastal cliffs, and even the ocean floor, together forming a 1,000-year-old mystery that no one has yet been able to solve. For example, on the eastern side of Kauai, along the Wailua River, stands an ancient structure known as the Akaka Falls Stone Dam. This dam is built from thousands of basalt blocks, each weighing several tons, stretching nearly 100 meters in length. Its construction is so precise that it looks as if it were cut by modern machinery. Even more astonishing, according to the oral history of native Hawaiians, the dam was built by the Menehune dwarves in a single night, on a full moon night. At the time, the chief of a tribe on Kauai sought help from the reclusive Menehune, who lived deep in the forests, hoping to build a waterway to irrigate their fields. The dwarves agreed, but with one condition: no human could see them at work. The chief accepted and immediately ordered all routes into the area closed for the night, and instructed the tribe not to step outside after dark. That very night, under the bright full moon, the only thing heard was the echoing sound of chisels and stones from the mountains. By the next morning, the chief discovered a solid stone dam standing across the wide river. Coincidentally, deep inside Quiloa Ranch on Oahu lies another ancient site, an agricultural ruin known as the Fairy Terraces. Built along the mountain slope, these terraces have 12 levels, each with a precisely measured height of 30 centimeters. Their edges are lined with smoothly polished volcanic rock, creating a structure both beautiful and functional. The drainage system within the terraces is remarkably clever as well, so effective that even during heavy rainy seasons, water never pools. Archaeologists who performed carbon-14 testing on the terrace soil found that the Fairy Terraces date back at least 2,500 years, a time when no known human civilization in the Hawaiian Islands possessed such advanced construction techniques. Adding to the mystery, a type of seaweed that exists only in the deep ocean grows year-round in the cracks between the terrace stones, as if these massive rocks were transported directly from the seafloor. But even these wonders pale in comparison to the most mysterious structure of all, the crystal stone wall beneath the north shore of Kauai. In 1992, during a NOAA survey of the area, researchers accidentally discovered a stone structure submerged 50 meters underwater. The wall stretches over 300 meters and is made of enormous hexagonal basalt blocks. Each block is covered with uniform spiral carvings, consistent depth, precise spacing, clearly shaped by human hands. The truly shocking part came after sonar imaging and sample analysis. The wall's construction dates back roughly 12,000 years. That places it at the very end of the last ice age, when sea levels were about 120 meters lower than today, and the site of the wall would have been an open plain. So who built this stone wall 12,000 years ago in ancient Hawaii? If the Menehune were responsible, why construct such a massive structure on what was once dry land? And after rising seas submerged it, where did the Menehune go? In the oral traditions of native Hawaiians, the Menehune were a real tribe that once existed. They were extremely small in stature, with adult individuals standing only 60 to 90 centimeters tall. Their skin was dark brown, their hair thick and curly, and their eyes large and deep, able to see clearly in the dark. They were highly skilled in stonework, woodworking, and weaving, possessing architectural abilities far ahead of their time. Yet they were reclusive by nature, avoiding contact with humans and choosing to live in remote mountain caves, deep forest hideouts, or even beneath the ocean. Kahiki Harmon, an anthropology professor at the University of Hawaii, once collected and organized more than 200 pieces of oral history related to the Menehune. Although these accounts came from different islands and from elders of different tribes, their core details were remarkably consistent. According to these records, the Menehune were not native to the Hawaiian Islands. They arrived in the year when a red star appeared in the sky, traveling in a vehicle shaped like an outrigger canoe, but capable of flying above the water. After they arrived, the Menehune did not engage in any conflict with the native islanders. Instead, they immediately chose to live in seclusion, helping humans only when they faced major hardships, and always doing so secretly at night. The most famous legend comes from Molokai. It is said that in the 12th century, the island suffered a severe drought that lasted 3 years. Rivers dried up, crops withered, and the tribe was on the brink of extinction. The tribal elders led their people in prayers to the Menehune, promising to give them the most fertile valley on the island in exchange for a canal to irrigate their fields. That very night, the tribe heard loud rumbling sounds coming from the valley. By the next morning, the elders discovered that a man-made canal stretching from the mountaintop to the shore had been completed. The canal's water source was an underground spring at the summit, and the flow was strong enough to irrigate all the farmland on the island. Astonishingly, the canal bed was lined entirely with smooth volcanic rock, and its walls were carved with intricate geometric patterns. These patterns repeatedly featured symbols resembling stars and waves, symbols that remain undeciphered to this day. But the legends of the Menehune are not confined to oral history alone. Archaeological sites in Hawaii have yielded unusual small artifacts that seem to support the existence of a dwarf people. In 1958, at an excavation site on Kauai, archaeologists unearthed a wooden figure about 15 centimeters tall. The figure had a short, sturdy build, an oversized head, deeply set eyes, and a faint, mysterious smile. The carving was made from a rare type of ebony found only in the high mountains of Kauai, at elevations above 1,500 meters. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Individual strands of hair and even fingerprints were clearly visible, evidence of a highly skilled artisan. At the time, many speculated that the artifact might have come from the Menehune themselves. Not only that, something even more unexpected happened in 1987 inside an ancient cave on Oahu. Archaeologists discovered a collection of small stone tools, including axes, knives, and hammers. Each tool was only 1/3 the size of typical human stone tools and weighed less than 500 grams. Yet their sharpness and craftsmanship far exceeded anything produced by humans of the same era. Through wear pattern analysis on the surfaces of these tools, archaeologists found that they had been used to cut hard basalt and to polish wood, perfectly matching the legends that describe the Menehune as masters of stonework and carpentry. However, these artifacts and legends have never been accepted by mainstream science. Skeptics argue that the so-called Menehune ruins are merely naturally formed geological structures, and that the small artifacts might have been ancient children's toys or ritual objects. But this explanation fails to account for the precisely interlocked stone blocks, the complex carved patterns, and the highly consistent oral traditions found across multiple islands. More importantly, in native Hawaiian culture, the Menehune are not treated as imaginary beings from myth. They are regarded as neighbors of the ancestors, a wise people who lived in harmony with nature. Such deeply rooted cultural awareness could not have formed out of thin air. As the 21st century began and technology advanced, humans finally gained the ability to explore Hawaii's deep ocean environments using sophisticated equipment. And with that, the legend of the Menehune began to inch from mythology toward the edge of reality. In 2012, NOAA's research vessel Okeanos Explorer conducted the first high-definition survey of the abyss of the Menehune off the northern coast of Kauai. When the ROV transmitted live images of the seafloor back to the ship, the entire research team was stunned. At a depth of 50 meters, the legendary crystal stone wall was clearly visible. The spiral carvings on the stone surface shimmered under the lights, as if they were some sort of cryptic code. Even more shocking, the ROV found several loose basalt blocks scattered nearby, each perfectly matching a missing section of the wall, as if it had been deliberately damaged in recent years. In subsequent surveys, researchers made an even more astonishing discovery. Beneath the wall was a circular opening about 10 meters in diameter. The rock around the entrance had been polished to a smooth finish, unmistakably showing signs of artificial excavation. As the ROV attempted to approach the opening, it suddenly picked up a series of high-frequency pulse signals. The signal strength changed based on the ROV's distance from the entrance, clearly indicating that the pulses were coming from inside the cavity. Even stranger, the frequency and coding of these pulses did not match any known human communication system, yet they displayed a distinct pattern, almost like an organized transmission of information. But just as the team attempted to send the ROV into the opening for a closer look, the vehicle abruptly lost all signal. In 2018, during a marine life survey in the abyss of the Menehune, a team of marine biologists from Kauai University accidentally recorded the mysterious knocking sound mentioned at the beginning. Dr. Carter Davis, the team leader, sent the audio samples to acoustic experts for analysis, and the results showed that the knocking was not produced by a natural phenomenon. Instead, it was the sound of a hard object striking basalt, with both the force and frequency precisely controlled. It did not resemble the behavior of any known marine creature. Rather, it sounded like the use of tools. To uncover the secret behind the knocking, Davis's team deployed multiple underwater recording devices and high-definition cameras around the time of the 15th day of the third lunar month in 2020, inside the abyss of the Menehune. On the night the knocking occurred, the cameras captured something almost unbelievable: a group of small, dark brown creatures moving near the stone wall. They were about 80 centimeters tall, with sturdy limbs, large heads, and eyes that emitted a faint green glow. These beings held hammer-like stone tools and repeatedly struck the wall in a rhythm that perfectly matched the monitored sound pattern. Due to dim lighting and their rapid movements, the cameras failed to capture clear facial features, but their size and behavior closely matched the descriptions of the legendary Menehune. When the footage was released, it caused an immediate global sensation. Some believed it was the strongest evidence yet that the Menehune truly existed. Others questioned its authenticity, arguing that the creatures might be some unknown marine species or part of a hoax. To settle the debate, Davis's team submitted the footage to a third-party agency for verification. The results confirmed that the video had not been edited or altered in any way, and that the creatures' silhouettes and movements were genuine. Even more surprising, after image enhancement analysis, experts discovered that the stone hammers held by the creatures bore the same spiral symbols found on the crystal stone wall. This indicated a close connection between these beings and the builders of the wall. Their knocking was likely not random. It might have been part of a ritual or an attempt to repair damaged sections of the structure. From a geographical perspective, the Hawaiian Islands are located in the Central Pacific, thousands of kilometers from the nearest continent, making them one of the most isolated archipelagos in the world. According to mainstream archaeological theory, human settlement in Hawaii began around 300 AD, established by immigrants from Polynesia. However, the construction dates of the Menehune-related structures far predate this period, suggesting that before the arrival of the Polynesians, a civilization with advanced architectural skills may have already existed on the islands. And that civilization was likely the Menehune. So, where did the Menehune come from? And why did they choose to settle in the Hawaiian Islands? According to the legends, they traveled in vehicles that could fly over water and arrived in the year when a red star appeared in the sky. These descriptions suggest that the tribe's origin may not have been earthly. In ancient myths, red stars are often seen as symbols of extraterrestrial civilizations, and vehicles that can fly over water closely resemble modern human descriptions of UFOs. This has led some to speculate that the Menehune may be descendants of an alien civilization, or perhaps the result of an experiment left on Earth by extraterrestrials. Another perspective holds that the Menehune were survivors of a prehistoric civilization. At the end of the last ice age, the Earth underwent dramatic geological changes. Rising sea levels submerged many continents, leading to the decline of ancient civilizations. Due to their remote location, the Hawaiian Islands may have served as a refuge for one such civilization, and the Menehune could be its descendants. Inheriting the advanced skills of their ancestors, they continued to live and thrive on the islands. Over time, as sea levels stabilized and human civilizations emerged, the reclusive nature of the Menehune led them to retreat into deep mountains and oceans, gradually being forgotten by humans, leaving behind only scattered legends and mysterious ruins. Whether they originated from an alien civilization or a prehistoric one, the legend of the Menehune reveals an important truth. Human understanding of Earth's civilizations may still have vast gaps. Before the emergence of human civilization, the Earth may have already hosted multiple advanced societies. These civilizations may have disappeared due to natural disasters, wars, or other unknown causes, leaving behind only enigmatic ruins and myths. The Menehune may well be the last living witnesses of these vanished civilizations.